Hello, everybody. Welcome to God Says. I'm your host, Tongue. What God says. God says. God says. Speak to me, God. Speak to me. Whole. That's in the spirit. Spirit that got a hole in it. Spirit that got a whole spirit. The whole spirit. The spirit. The whole of the spirit. Speak to me. Speak to me. God says somebody have a headache in all 50 states. God says somebody has a headache. God says somebody have a headache. God says. God says. In the Ukraine, somebody has stomach ache. God says it's a kid that don't want to go to school today, but God says that kid's gonna want to go to school because they're serving applesauce today. And God says, you're gonna get that car that you always wanted. God says, oh yeah, God says you're gonna get that car. If a young man want a car, God says you're gonna get that car. God says after all these years, yes, your father's finally gonna get you that Matchbox car that you want. God says, oh yes, yes. God says this is for a young lady. God says you're going to get that dream house that you always wanted. That dream house that you always wanted. That dream house that your father could not get you when you was little. God says you're going to be able to get the Barbie house that you want. Right, yes, the Barbie fun house with Ken. God says, yes, God says. God says today. God says traffic is going to be a lot of traffic today. God says some people are going to drink coffee today. God says, and God says somebody drink tea. And God says somebody drink hot chocolate. And God says somebody spill their hot chocolate, their coffee or their tea. And God says, let me see. God says, oh, you left something. Somebody going to school today, and God says they left their book. God says, go back and get your book. God says you're going to take a driver's test today. And then God says that you're kind of feared. But God says, yes, you should be feared, God says, because you're going to have a crash. You're going to have an accident. God says, God says, don't go to Whole Foods, because God said you'll be eating the whole food. God says go to God. God says God says go to Food Bazaar. God says because the food is very bizarre. God says if you pray over it like the rabbi, God says it won't be bizarre. It'll be kosher. God says. I'm your host of God Says. When I tell you what God said. God says.